The camera lights were burning hot, and the audience was restless. It was late 1975, and the studio smelled like stale cigarette smoke and carpet that had seen too many feet. John Lennon sat on a stool in the middle of the stage, guitar resting against his knee, waiting for the segment to start. His hair was longer than it had been in years. His eyes looked tired. He hadn't performed live in front of people like this in a long time, and you could see it in the way he held his shoulders, like he was carrying something heavy he didn't want anyone to notice. The host was still shuffling note cards. The audience murmured. Someone coughed. John looked down at his hands and turned one of the tuning pegs on his guitar, even though it didn't need adjusting. He wasn't nervous about playing. He was nervous about being seen. There was a man in the third row, older than most of the crowd, maybe 40, maybe 50. Hard to tell. His face was red, and his jaw was tight, and his arms were crossed so hard across his chest, it looked like he was trying to hold himself together. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He was just staring at John with a look that could crack glass. John noticed him. He always noticed the ones who didn't clap. The host finally waved to the band, and the segment began. John played a new song, something soft, something about starting over. His voice was steady, but there was a crack in it that hadn't been there before. The kind of crack that comes from years of being loud and then learning how to be quiet. The audience listened. Some of them swayed. Some of them smiled. But the man in the third row didn't move. He just sat there, staring, like he was waiting for something to break. When the song ended, the applause was warm but not wild. John nodded, set the guitar down gently, and wiped his palms on his jeans. The host asked him a few questions. Soft ones, safe ones, the kind you ask someone who's been through enough already. John answered them with the kind of humor that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Then the host opened it up to the audience. Anyone have a question for John? Hands shot up. A woman in the front asked about his son. A young guy asked about the new album. John answered them all with patience, leaning forward a little, like he wanted to make sure they felt heard. And then the man in the third row stood up. The room got quieter. Not silent, but close. You could feel the shift. The man didn't wait to be called on. He just stood there, and when he spoke, his voice was louder than it needed to be. You walked away. John looked at him. Didn't say anything yet. Just looked. The man's hands were shaking. You had everything. You had the biggest band in the world. You had millions of people who loved you. And you just walked away. You left. You gave up. The audience shifted in their seats. A few people glanced at each other. The host opened his mouth to say something, but John raised a hand, just slightly, and the host stopped. John stood up slowly. He didn't move toward the man. He just stood there, hands at his sides, looking at him across the rows of seats. Yeah, John said. I did. The man's face got redder. My son idolized you. He had every record, every poster. He wanted to be like you. And then you disappeared. You stopped making music. You stopped caring. John took a breath, a long one. The kind you take when you're deciding whether to say something true or something easy. I didn't stop caring, John said quietly. I stopped performing. What's the difference? The man shot back. His voice cracked a little on the last word. And suddenly, it wasn't anger anymore. It was something else. Something that had been sitting inside him for a long time. John looked down for a second, then back up. The difference is, I had a kid too. The man blinked. His arms loosened just a little. And I didn't want to be the kind of father who was never home, John continued. I didn't want my son to grow up thinking I loved strangers more than I loved him. So I stayed. I stopped touring. I stopped chasing the noise. And I know that disappointed people. I know it hurt people. But I can't be everything to everyone. I can't be a symbol and a person at the same time. The man stood there, breathing hard like he'd been running. His hands were still shaking. My son, he started, and then stopped. My son doesn't talk to me anymore. The room held its breath. John didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Then he took a step forward. Not aggressive, just closer. Why not? John asked. Not like he was challenging him, like he actually wanted to know. The man swallowed hard. Because I was never there. I worked all the time. I thought providing for him was enough. I thought he'd understand. John nodded slowly. And now you're angry at me because I chose different. The man's face crumpled, just for a second. Then he pulled it back together, but it was too late. Everyone had seen it. I'm angry, the man said, because you made it look easy. John let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so sad. It wasn't easy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Walking away from something you love, that's not easy. Staying when everyone's calling you a coward, that's not easy either. The man looked down. His shoulders sagged. John took another step. But you know what's harder? The man looked up, living with the idea that you could have done it differently and didn't. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. The man's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to fix it. John shook his head. I don't know either. But I know that beating yourself up doesn't fix it. And blaming me doesn't fix it. The only thing that fixes it is showing up. Even if it's late. Even if it's hard. Even if you don't know what to say. The man's eyes filled up. He didn't wipe them. He just stood there, holding it. John walked down off the stage. The host looked confused. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay quiet. John walked down the aisle, past the first row, past the second, and stopped in front of the man. He didn't hug him. He didn't shake his hand. He just stood there, close enough that the man could see he wasn't perfect either, that his eyes were tired too, that he'd been carrying something heavy too. Call him, John said. Tonight. Don't wait. Don't rehearse it. Just call him. The man nodded. Once. Twice. Like he was trying to convince himself. John turned and walked back to the stage. The audience erupted into applause. But it wasn't the kind of applause you give a performance. It was the kind you give someone who just did something real. The rest of the taping was a blur. John played one more song. Answered a few more questions. But the energy had shifted. Everyone in that room had just watched something break open. After the show, John went back to the dressing room and sat down on the couch. His hands were still shaking a little. He picked up a notebook from the table and opened it to a blank page. He stared at it for a long time. Then he started writing. The song didn't come fast. It took weeks, maybe months. He'd write a line, cross it out, write it again. He'd hum melodies in the kitchen while making tea. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with a verse in his head and stumble to the piano in the dark. When it was finally done, he didn't release it right away. He sat with it, played it for his wife, played it for a few friends. One of them asked what it was about. And John just shrugged. A guy I met, he said. What happened to him? John smiled a little. I don't know. I hope he made the call. The song eventually made it onto an album. It wasn't a single. It wasn't a hit. But people who heard it felt something. They didn't always know why. There was a line in the chorus that stuck with them. Something about being brave enough to be small. About choosing one person over 1,000. Years later, a journalist asked John about it. Asked if it was autobiographical. John thought for a moment. It's about a choice I made, and a choice I watched someone else wrestle with. I don't know if he ever made it, but I hope he did. The journalist pressed. Do you regret walking away? From the band? From the fame? John looked out the window. I regret the people I hurt. I regret not explaining it better. But I don't regret choosing my son. I got to see him grow up. I got to be there. That's not something you get back. And the music? John smiled. The music never left. It just got quieter. The man in the third row never came forward. Never gave an interview. Never told his side of the story. But a few people who were there that night said they saw him in the hallway afterward, leaning against the wall, phone pressed to his ear, tears running down his face. No one knows what he said. No one knows if the call was answered. But they saw him dial. They saw him wait. And they saw him speak. The song John wrote didn't change the world. It didn't climb the charts. It didn't win awards. But it meant something to the people who needed it. The ones who had walked away. The ones who had stayed too long. The ones who were still trying to figure out what being brave really meant. John never talked about that night much. He didn't frame it as a lesson. He didn't write an essay about it. He just lived with it. Carried it. Let it shape the way he moved through the rest of his life. Because courage, he learned, isn't always loud. It isn't always on stage. Sometimes it's in a phone call you don't know how to start. Sometimes it's in admitting you don't have all the answers. Sometimes it's in standing still when everyone expects you to run. And sometimes it's in writing a song for one person, even if 1,000,000 people hear it. The lights in the studio had long since gone dark. The audience had gone home. The cameras were packed away. But something had shifted that night. Something small. Something human. And in the quiet, in the space between what was said and what wasn't, there was the faint echo of a man's voice on the other end of a phone line, saying the only thing that mattered. I'm sorry. Can we talk?